The next ones we are sketching the graph of the sine or cosine function, and before we actually do the problem, you want to have what a normal sine or cosine graph without any shifts look like. So if I'm doing the sine curve has a period of 2 pi. It starts at 0 and one cycle goes 2 pi. On the sine curve, at the beginning and the end, you are at 0, and halfway between there, you're also at 0. For the sine function, it is going to go up the amplitude and down the amplitude halfway between. So this would be pi over 2, and this would be at 3 pi over 2. And so your sine curve looks something sort of like this, only it just keeps going and going and going and going. So if you're thinking about your table, you have 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And for a regular sine curve with no shifts, you have 0 and 0 and 0. 0 at the beginning, the middle, and the end. Here you're going to go up your amplitude, whatever your amplitude might be. Here you're going to do the opposite of your amplitude, whatever the amplitude might be, and we'll talk about the amplitude when we get to graphing this function right here. Cosine function has a period of 2 pi. So 0 to 2 pi is one complete cycle. Again, we're going to have our same markers where we're splitting things in half. So for the cosine function, you're going to start up at the amplitude, you're going to end at the amplitude. And halfway between, you're going to do negative the amplitude, whatever it might be. Here you're going to cross the x-axis because you're going to look something like that when you do your cosine curve. So for your cosine curve, you have 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Here you're going to be at your amplitude, here you're going to be at your amplitude, here you'll be at the opposite of your amplitude, and 0 and 0 between those things. So I scribbled all over. You probably want to make your notes not quite in the middle of where we're going to do number 7, but I am now going to do number 7, and so I'm going to move the board and erase that so I have some room to write. So number 7 says 3/2 sine of x plus pi over 3. This value here is going to be your amplitude. Now normally when you do the amplitude, they'll call this A, and the amplitude they always give is a positive number, but depending if that's positive or negative, it tells you if you're going to go up first or down first. Since this is positive, I'm going to go up to 3/2 first. If it was negative, I would go down to 3/2 when I go down. But keeping in mind my normal sine curve, 0, 0, pi over 2 is at your amplitude, pi is at 0, 3 pi over 2 is at your amplitude, actually at your opposite your amplitude. Let me write that. Minus your amplitude, and 2 pi is at 0. Now this is going to have a shift to it. So what you're going to do for the shift is you're going to set this equal to each of your normal x values. So I'm going to say x plus pi over 3 equals 0 and solve it. X plus pi over 3 equals pi over 2 and solve it. X plus pi over 3 equals pi and solve it. X plus pi over 3 equals 2 pi. Not 2 pi, 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 and solve it. And x plus pi over 3 equals 2 pi. So I set them each equal to each of my normal x values. So if I'm going to solve, I'm going to subtract pi over 3, which gives me negative pi over 3. Here I'm going to subtract pi over 3. I'd have to find my common denominator, which is 6. So I'd have 3 pi over 6 minus 2 pi over 6, which gives me pi over 6. Here I'm going to subtract my pi over 3. So I'm going to have 3 pi over 3 minus pi over 3, which is 2 pi over 3. Fun with fractions. Here I'm going to subtract my pi over 3. So common denominator would be 6. 2 goes into 6 3 times, so that would be 9. 3 goes into 6 2 times, so I get 7 pi over 6. And then 2 pi minus my pi over 3 means I'd have 6 pi over 3 minus pi over 3, which is 5 pi over 3. So now these are going to be my new x values, but the values for my other things are going to stay the same. So at pi over 3, this is at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each of those are pi over 6. So pi over 3 would be 2 pi over 6. I'm going to be at 0. At pi over, oops, wait a minute, that was supposed to be negative. 0 minus pi over 3, let me fix that. Negative pi over 3, I should be at 0. So I should be back here. Okay, pi over 6 would be 1 mark over. I'm going to be up to my amplitude, which is 3/2, so up to 1.5. 2 pi over 3 would be 4 pi over 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to be at 0. 0 in the middle. Now the next one I'm going to go down to my amplitude at 7 pi over 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm going to go down to negative 1.5. Since my amplitude there is 3/2, I'm going to do negative 3/2 there. And then at 5 pi over 3, which would be 10 pi over 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I'm back at 0. So my sine curve, one cycle, is going to look something like that. Now you're going to put those 5 points on your graph, and then it's going to complete your graph for you. Now if you want, you can use the plot point tool and type in your ordered pairs instead of having to figure out where on the graph it goes. It's probably easier for you to do that. Since I don't have a plot point tool, I had to figure out where I was at as far as each of these to get to pi is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each line is pi over 6, and I figured it out from there. So, number 8, we're going to do a cosine graph. So I got to think about my normal table for cosine. Cosine, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. For cosine, we start at the amplitude, we end at the amplitude, and we go negative the amplitude in the middle. At pi and 3 pi over 2, we're at 0, partway in between. So we want to do the same kind of thing. Here my amplitude is going to be 3. So I'm going to have 3, negative 3, and 3. I got to figure out my shift. So I'm going to do x minus 2 pi over 3 equals 0. X minus 2 pi over 3 equals pi over 2. X minus 2 pi over 3 equals pi. X minus 2 pi over 3 equals 3 pi over 2. And x minus 2 pi over 3 equals 2 pi. So on each of these, I'm going to add 2 pi over 3. I'm just going to put it down there. So 0 plus 2 pi over 3 would be 2 pi over 3. Here I'd have to find my common denominator, so it's going to be over 6. 2 goes into 6 3 times. 3 goes in there 2 times 2 is 4, so I get 7 pi over 6. Here I'm going to have 3 pi over 3 plus 2 pi over 3, which is 5 pi over 3. Here again I'm going to go over 6. 2 goes in there 3 times, so 9. 3 goes in there 2 times, so 4. 9 plus 4 gives me 13 pi over 6. And then here I'm going to go over 3, so 6 pi over 3 plus 2 pi over 3 is 8 pi over 3. Again, if I look at this one, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each of these is pi over 6. If it's over 3, I have to do double that. So 2 pi over 3 would be 4 pi over 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. Since this is cosine, I'm going to go up to my amplitude first. So I'm going to go up to 3. 7 pi over 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's going to cross right at 0 because our next point is at 0. Now we're going to go to negative 3 at 5 pi over 3, which would be 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Goes all the way down to negative 3 for our next point. The next one's going to be at 0. So 13 pi over 6, this was at 10. 11, 12, 13. And then the next one's going to go up to our amplitude at 3. 8 pi over 3 would be 16. So 13, 14, 15, 16 goes back up here. And our cosine curve, and when you hit it, it's going to do a lot of cycles, but that'll be one cycle of our cosine curve. So starts at the top, my amplitude down to the bottom is in the middle, halfway between, we cross at 0, and so our table looks something sort of like that. Number 9, we're back to our sine curve. So for our sine curve, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Our sine curve, 0, 0, and 0. Then here we're at our amplitude. Here we're at our negative, our amplitude. And like I said, if this happens to be a negative, you'll do the negative first and then the positive. Those two things will switch around. Since it's positive, we're going to do the positive first and the negative second. So, doing our shift. X minus pi over 4 is going to equal 0. Equal pi over 2. Equal pi. Equal 3 pi over 2. And equal 2 pi. So in all of these, we have to add our pi over 4. I don't know where I was looking there. So here I'm just going to get pi over 4. Here I am going to have 4 for my common denominator, so I'd have 2 pi over 4 plus 1 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 4, right? 1/2 plus 1/4 is 3/4. Here I'm going to have 4 pi over 4 plus pi over 4, which is 5 pi over 4. Here, 6 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 7 pi over 4. And 8 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 9 pi over 4. So, this one, notice I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of my lines is pi over 4. At pi over 4, we're starting at 0 since we're doing the sine curve. At 3 pi over 4, 1, 2, 3, we're going up to our amplitude, which is 2.5. At 5 pi over 4, that was at 3, 4, 5, we're at 0 again. 0 is our third one. 7 pi over 4, we're down to our amplitude, so down to negative 2.5. And then at 9, we're back to 0. So sine curve, 0 at the beginning, 0 in the middle, 0 at the end. If our amplitude is positive, we go up first. If it would be negative, we'd go down first. And so when we connect our dots, our sine curve is going to look something sort of like that.